Hi everybody and welcome back to my painting channel. Today I'm going to be doing a watercolour for you. It's going to be done of a small dinghy sitting on the river. Well, not so much a river, it's the Royal Military Canal that runs through the centre of Hythe, where my gallery is in Kent. So to that end, sit back, enjoy the video. I hope you get something from it, I'm sure you will. And if you do, at the end, maybe you would place a like upon the video, if you would. And at the same time, if you've got any ideas, if you've liked the video or have any thoughts on it, or indeed would like to think of something that you'd like to see me video for the future and put on the channel, then put a comment in the comment section below. But moreover, if you'd be so kind as to subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it lets you know as and when future videos will be going up. Now this video is going to be put up in its full entire length. Okay, so in the future some of those will go to a Patreon page, which I am in the middle of sorting out, so it's not there yet, but that will be the place later for all the full content and all the extras that I create through my channel. But for the foreseeable future, for one or two videos certainly, I want to put up fuller content to give you some idea of what I'm about and what my work is about. So as I say, please like, please subscribe, and please comment, all at the end. I appreciate that very much. So until that time, happy painting. I'll catch you all on the next video. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Right, here we go. Do the pencil drawing. Now it's being done on heavyweight paper. This is a 300-pound hot press paper from I think it's Saunders Waterford. It's a nice thick cardy paper and it absorbs the watercolour very well and allows the moisture to continue to remain within the paper for quite a long time, allowing you a lot more working time. But from the drawing point of view, I'm decided to do a small dinghy, and it's one that is part of a concession of several dinghies that sit on the Royal Military Canal in Hythe in Kent. Now that's not far from my gallery as it happens, so I can easily go along and see them, sketch them, and enjoy people or seeing people using them. The actual Royal Military Canal is a man-made canal that was created by the Army of Wellington as a defence against potential Napoleonic attack. And it's a piece of engineering. It's amazing because it goes from the coast nearby to Hythe all the way down through the Romney Marshes and ends up at a place called Iden Lock, which is just outside of Rye. And each length is one cannon distance, so a cannon on one bank can shoot all the way down to the next point, and then a little further, then the cannon will take on for the next position. So end of the history lesson, let's get back to the drawing. I've put the little dinghy quite high on the paper, and I think that works well compositionally because it gives a much greater dynamic, and it also allows for a simple set of water beyond the dinghy, but also some lovely reflections and ripples reflecting the sky and the foliage that's on the bank beyond in the foreground. So it makes a lot more interesting, I think. So yeah, let's just carry on watching the drawing being done, and we'll pick it up in a minute. I think one thing you've got to note when you are doing the sketch for a watercolour is that you don't need to have every piece of it absolutely as it should be. I've always said to my students that, you know, try and get a good competent drawing in, but if every subtle change is not exactly as the reference is, or if you're working from photos or whether you're working from live plein air, it matters not. You're trying to create a feeling of the object. No need to be absolutely precise. Now, on the original photograph at this point, there are no seats sitting in the boat. I guess the owners remove those so that it's a little bit harder for somebody to steal the dinghy. So I've put some in. Whether or not they're in the right place, it doesn't really make a lot of odds. And the drawing is quite simple, and it's getting ready for me to now apply colour. Now I'm pretty much done with this drawing and getting ready for painting. And I'm just putting one or two little situations with regards to the reflections. I added the duck that's in the shade of the boat, and the buoy that's attaching it and keeping it where it should be in the middle of the river. So, you know, I don't want to put too many marks in to suggest the water, just rough guides really, just little situations that suggest to me where darker areas might be, lighter areas might be, and I'm not overdoing it. So I'm pretty much done now, and I think we're ready to look at adding some colour and getting the first of the washes in place. Now, ranges of brushes, I've got quite a few at my disposal, and I do use a medium-sized squirrel mop for the wash. If I'm using a larger piece of paper, I'll use a much larger squirrel mop. I'm mixing up copious amounts of cobalt blue at the moment. The thing is that when you're doing a wash, always try and make sure you have enough colour pre-mixed, because if you have to stop and remix, sometimes you're not, well, most often you're not going to get the same colour, which would be disappointing. And the other thing is that you will need to keep this flow of water, the bead. Now I've got my paper set at probably 30 degrees of an angle on my easel. I like it quite shallow, but I like it deep enough for allowing that flow of colour and water down the page. So I'm adding more, and I'm working around the edge of the boat as I go. It's pure cobalt blue at this stage, nothing more. Taking great care to work around significantly different edges. I mean, the boat is much different in terms of value colour with a bit of light on it, and so too the buoy, which is completely different in colour as well. But when it comes to areas where it's going to be darker in the water, then you can just plough on through with that blue colour. But what is most important is you keep the wet bead, i.e. the leading edge of that colour that you're running down, that lovely wash that's coming down the page, you keep that leading edge of water nice and wet. You can see the edges where it's built up, and it's not drying. If you allow those lead edges to dry, then you've pretty much finished your wash, and you're going to end up with a hard edge left over, and that you don't want. So be aware of that when you are working. I often ignore phones and conversations with anybody when I'm doing a wash, because I do not have the time to be distracted from such things. By the time I've answered the telephone or a query, the water or the wash has dried up. For this part, I've added a little bit of phthalocyanine blue into my wash, and I think that works for the side of the boat. But it doesn't matter if that mixes with the cobalt blue either. Trying to preserve the duck as much as I can, albeit the duck is going to be darker. I still want not too much cool colour underlying what will be quite warm values in the duck at a later stage. Don't be in a hurry to get rid of all the white paper you might leave. It's not a big deal. So there's a lot more phthalocyanine blue going into the mix. You can see the copious amounts of water in the wash. And you can also see the effect by not allowing that lead edge to start drying up on me. It means to say that I can carry on working that wash down. There's no need to hurry. A lot of people think that when they start doing a wash, they have to rush. And you don't have to rush. If you're using significantly good quality paper, like a 300-pound that is being used now, there's enough dampness remaining in the paper to allow you to add to the wash as you go on. You've seen me add to the top of the wash, and now you're seeing me adding new colours, which is a little bit of phthalocyanine green coming in, just to give that water a change as it comes down to the foreground. But all the time, the bead is wet, it's nice, and I can add to it. Bit more phthalo green going in, and both the blues that I've been using, just making it a little bit more significant in the foreground, a little bit more deeper colour. And as that dries up, that will give me those fewer bands, subtle bands and shade changes or value changes within the water in the foreground. Now we're actually putting in quite a bit more phthalo green now. So now I'm going to mix up a little bit more phthalo blue and just come into the boat and add that beautiful, I don't know if it's not a turquoise colour, but that sort of man-made painted boat colour that these small dinghies are. Checking out as I go where I really want these blues to be placed. And it's no good just putting colour for the sake of it anywhere you like. Put it where it needs to be. Now I know that sounds a pretty silly statement, but I see a lot of students that because they are not paying close attention to where they're putting colour, and because they have copious amounts on their brush, then they start dabbing and placing it in other places, and not always in the right places, so be aware of that. Less pigment and more water. You can see that what's happened now is I've taken and pushed pure waters and very little pigment into the side of that boat, but what it did do is as it touched the stronger pigment that I put round almost as an edge liner, it picked that up and drew it out, and so it gave this wonderful immediate blend of the two edges, which is quite important. We're coming into the bottom of the boat now with the blues, and I've changed it to quite a bit more cobalt into there, and maybe just a touch of magenta as well, just to give it that cool shadowy look underneath the boat and defining the shade that's underneath the seats as well. A little bit more difficult because I don't have the reference to painting these areas, so I'm pretty much making this up as I go along. But you can see from the picture of the reference how I'm making the decisions as I go and move forward. Now the blue that I'm using here is ultramarine violet, and it gives that lovely warmth into the blues, that little bit of redness, violet texture into the blues. It's a little grainy too, so it just adds to that deeper colour, but still keeping the transparency of the paper radiating through the paint. Many of the colours I do use are transparent colours. I like to see that. I will use opaques, but as often as I can, I will use transparents. And don't forget, things like phthalo blue and phthalo green are transparent colours. Now I decided that I put that blue on the transom, and then I use the damp brush to pick up and take away quite a bit of the pigment. Now it's very much the same way that I lifted excess colour from the edges of the paper to stop it running. It's literally putting it on and taking a little bit off. And here we are doing it again. So you get to see that, you know, if you put a color on that's just a little bit too much, you do have that chance while it's damp just to pick it up with a damp brush that is clean, of course, and just lift it back off. And the idea also is, I mean, it allows you to give that subtle shade of the color that is predominantly the boat is blue, but it also allows to suggest that you've got the shadows that are darker underneath, but you're taking some back, which allows the light effect to be hitting those seats and the transom. So now I'm sort of mixing up a little bit of a dirty blue. The blue is there with a little bit of phthalo green in it, and it's just going to suggest a little darker element of the reflection. I always understand and go by the principle that water reflects the opposite of what it's reflecting. By that I mean, if an item is quite pale and light above the water, the reflection would appear quite darker. And also the reverse can be said, a dark object will reflect quite lighter. And basically what that does, and assuming that I've got my information right, I think it works that way, is that you are suggesting that the tonal value shifts in water. It becomes much closer together than the object being reflected. I don't want to make that too confusing, but the idea being that light colours are less light colours and dark colours are less dark colours, so therefore the contrast changes or shifts between the two in reflection are a lot closer than they are otherwise. I'm adding a lot of greens and suggesting now for the water. So I'm mixing up greens. I'm mixing up some cobalts and Indian yellow. I'm mixing up some cadmium reds, and I'm mixing up some transparent oranges with the greens. So I'm giving myself a variety of green shades, dirty grey shades, greeny grey shades, but take time to mix up many of these ahead of time and make sufficient amounts, you know. It's not a case of, if you do this and you're allowing bits to dry, you won't have enough to do the job. So try hard to think about this, that quantity and the purity of the pigment, and checking the colours you're looking for, whether you want them cooler, whether you want them warmer, before you start, because it's a little bit late to add more to it or try and get all those colour mixes right again if you run out before the end of the painting. Now invariably we can't always get it right, but just take your time, add water to it and add the pigment as you need it. So I'm going to put in a wash now of a fairly mid-green colour that's going to suggest the foliage that's beyond on the bank, and that's reflected into the river itself, and it will also help me as an aid to isolate the boat where I need it to, but suggest the movement in the water and the reflections of the sky, and just create that lovely subtle idea of a flowing river. Lots of phthalo blue, lots of transparent orange. You can see all these mixes coming in and being utilized. And again, this wash, the business of keeping that bead fresh and alive. You can see where the water's settling at the top of the paper. I can pick on that, I can bring it in, I can add it into another bit, let it flow down, create line, and I'm visually drawing with the brush. So, you know, it's wet and I can add to it, but nothing is drying up, so I'm not leaving hard lines. Now this is not the only colour that I'm using in the water. It's merely the colour that I've got in the brush at the moment, and I'm looking around the paper to see where I want more of that colour to be represented in my painting. Now you'll notice I'm working much more water on this side in the greens. I can add to that, and I'm adding to the greeny effects with phthalo greens. Now you can see the color has changed, and that's fine. Now if I didn't want that to happen, but I created a situation where I did need to add more, I've already made a mistake. In other words, I can't mix that same color green. As it happens, it works because there is that lighter color as it recedes away from me and gets a much stronger defined green as it comes up to the foreground, so I can work that in. I'm still wanting a dark green to the left hand side, and that's fine too. So I'm before I do get any problems with the beads drying up, I am trying to finish this section so I can allow that to dry and then move on with the foreground. I've not brought any greens into the left hand side of the foreground because that's going to be a much different area of color. That's going to be reflective of clouds in the sky, but not necessarily trees. So it's going to be a subdued, muted bluey green, bluey violet color, which you'll see in a minute when I decide to mix that up. One of the tricks with watercolor also is to know when and how wet that paper is before you add the next pigment. Again, I'm skipping around here, I'm drawing with the brush because I'm trying to suggest the ripples or the disturbance in the water, tracking the way that that duck has swum in towards the edge of the boat. So it's a lead in for the duck. And it creates a narrative too. There's a narrative to the painting, a little story within the painting, which is important. It's about the boat, it's about the duck, and it just adds that little bit of narrative, a bit more interest. The thing about a lot of my paintings is I do try and find that little story tag within the painting, that little bit of narrative that gives that extra interest to the viewer. And it's also a way that the viewer can identify with the painting, experiences, personal experiences. You see these things and it's a little reminiscent. So I just feel it's a nice touch. But it's also divisive because by leaving and skipping that paper, it's not pure white because we've already put the blue values of the sky tones in that water. But it allows you to have the effect of ripples and disturbed water. Now I'm working the edges right up to the boat. I think you've got to be very careful that you don't leave areas that are around it that aren't meant to be left. It will look as though the boat is just stuck onto the paper, and we've got to be careful of that. Now that paper is damp. You see that by the way that this pigment is running through. So the wash that I put on is it's still damp. The thing is, if that was cheaper paper, if that was like £90 paper, £140 paper, that could quite easily have dried up too much to allow what's just happened there to happen. So it's nice to work on that heavyweight paper so that you can see the glisten on it now. It's re-wetted and that paint underneath it is still viable. Now I don't want to do too much more with these ripples here, so I'm tidying up the edges. I don't want the lower sections to dry out very dark with pigment, so I'm taking off excess of colour that has built up as the water's worked its way down to the edge or the base of the wet areas of paint. I'm just cleaning it up really. Cooler greens. Now I'm going to be looking at adding some Indian yellow and cooling the greens down, but keeping them fairly lively, just adds another pigment or hue to the whole thing. And it's more about the reflection of the boat being somewhat darker and adding another element. This is where observation is quite key, because again, I'm literally drawing, I'm painting, but I'm drawing with a brush. I'm paying two things. I'm paying heed to the colors and the values of the color that I'm putting in, but I'm also paying heed to leaving that clear paper underneath to allow the further illusion of the disturbance of water. So just small careful touches of pigment over that. The paint will not go anywhere I don't want it to go, which is not wet. So you get the illusion, I think, that the ducks just swum in and turned into the boat, into the shade. The choice of putting tape around my paper to start with is a personal one. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. I love to see a lovely white border around my finished watercolors. So although I start off with in this occasion, a quarter imperial, which is 15 by 11 approximately, I sort of would lose 2 inches on all those dimensions. So I end up with a 13 by 9 image. That's a choice. And I don't think it's a bad choice. For me, I enjoy that. I like to see that white border, as I say. Sometimes I don't get the tape set down enough and I get paint underneath it and running. So then when I come to frame it and matte the painting, I do have to go right up to the image and I lose the effect of the white border. But that's once in a while. Now, although we're sort of getting close to finishing touches and finer detail, I just want to put in this much paler greenish colour that's suggestive maybe of clouds or more distant higher trees behind the darker, more yellow greens that are in the background. So it's giving you a different set of ripples in the water as we come forward and finish off in the foreground. What you can use all of these marks for, you can see throughout the painting that the direction of the brush mark quite clearly gives you an indication of the flow of water. And I think that's important because, you know, you are literally adding colors to a surface and it's the direction of the brush that suggests so much. Once again, you'll see me touching that pure pigment. Now that pure pigment still on those eddies is still wet enough. And so when you touch it with some of the colors that you've got in the brush with the water at the time, it picks it up, breaks it out and allows that pigment to flow out and mold itself or mix itself with the colors you've been using. So you get a nice hard edge on one side, for instance, but you get this beautiful transition of color from the darker to the lighter as it spreads on into where the paint has allowed it. So time now to put a little bit of extra detail to work on. I'm going to start by putting in a magenta wash into the buoy. This will just suggest the lighter aspects, but it gives that warmth, albeit a cool warmth being magenta, but it's all there. And if you know, we've got a predominantly greenish, bluish painting at the moment, so I do need to have that little bit of warmth coming on. And one way to do that is maybe the transom of the boat, like so, with a little bit more orange into that and make it a little bit more brownish. The duck too will add to that, and at the same time the buoy. Now making the reflection a little bit of a dirty grey, so I've got the nice magenta colour, but orange. So I do want to make that a little bit duller, so I want to mix up. I don't want such a loud orange on one side as I do on the other. So okay, so what I've done is I've used predominantly transparent orange, but on one part I increased the ultramarine violet to that, and then on the other side almost pure orange, and then I used the brush just to take off some of that and lighten it up again. Now I'm going to start building up some detail. I'm going back in with the cyanin blue, and I'm sort of adding much more detail to the image now, starting refining shapes, bring the shapes down to much smaller pieces of detail. The brush has changed to a smaller brush, smaller round brush, a little bit more control, almost neat phthalo blue going in. Here I've got a nice mix of the cobalt and a little bit of the ultramarine violet, just as the shadow areas underneath the seats. You can see that lovely warmth in the blue compared to the yellowness of the phthalo blue. But they serve well to sort of add that yin-yang between blues, that cool and that warm. Sometimes again it's nice to put that strong colour in, but then just ease off down one side of it with some more water in the brush, a little bit damper, and take off that hard edge on both sides. Makes for a nice easy transition between one shape to the next. Now I'm adding some indigo into the whole thing. This is a much stronger yellow blue. It's not unlike a Prussian blue, but I prefer indigo. It's a nice transparent colour, and it makes a delicious dark. So if you really want a rich dark, then use indigo, and I would use that with some like transparent oranges or umbers, that sort of thing. But the darks are really rich, really delicious. And defining the edge of the boat now. But you can see what a lovely contrast it is between the two. Once more, breaking out that strong edge of colour. And that dark will run into it quite nicely, so there isn't that hard edge line, but you can see that transition. You've got the dark edge, but you have it running into the next shape really beautifully. Now let's look at the reflection. Preserve the duck, don't lose that. I nearly chopped its head off then. But that is a really rich bluish green that's gone in. Now you could have actually made, I could have actually made that a lot bluer, I think, but I quite like the idea of that somewhat being less blue. It throws the boat out more, putting all those little bits of detail that set the boat up as something really quite nice, real, defining water lines around the transom now, and starting to suggest those reflections as well, the little ripples, the little subtle nuances in the brush marks that make the little jerky bits that suggest water as opposed to a solid object that sits upon the water. When you add dark lines like this around the edge where the boat touches and is at the deepest part of its shadow, it really just throws out the boat and makes it sit up and say, hey, I'm here. It just stands out. And that's down to using the right values and getting that contrast just about right. But you must always remember that whatever colour you use in watercolour, always try and think of it, I try and use the analogy that it's a bit like a photograph. When you're taking a photograph, if you underexpose it by 2/3 of a stop, you get a much richer colour as opposed to maybe taking what the camera tells you to take, or even overexposing it, which will make it look weedy and washed out. When you paint in this way with watercolour, you know it's going to dry up much lighter than the colour you have on the brush at the time. So try and allow for that. Try and allow for a pigment that's just a little bit darker than where you really want that painting to end up. And if you do that, then chances are it's going to end up drying up roughly where you really wanted that to be in the beginning. Just adding a few more darker bits of green to the reflection of the water, almost like a secondary ripple. It just helps define the back end of the boat. Now I'm putting the duck in, and the duck I made a mix up of orange and a little bit of Indian red. Indian red's quite a dull red, and it's a nice earthy brickish red, so it's got some coolness about it, which is really useful and great into some of the shadows and what have you on things like this. So you've got that yin yang again between the larks and the lights, and this is a female mallard, so she's pretty, should I dare say, drab, and she is. She's lots of browns and lots of, up close she's beautiful, but at this sort of distance you're not going to see too much detail, but we do know that she's going to be that much warmer than all those lovely cool colors around her, the cool greens, the cool blues. They're going to be a vastly different temperature than she is. So I'm putting that lovely warm value into her now before I start putting some detail, darker bits in. A little bit of a, not cadmium red, I use a vermilion. And that we're looking at now the shadow side of the buoy. Do I take that all the way across? I think so. I think there's sufficient there to allow that little bit of light at the top. So by continuing right across with that colour, we can then let that go off a little bit, or add some stronger pigments into the base, some pure oranges and reds now going in to suggest that stronger shape sitting on the water. Now I'm going to cool down the temperature of that red by putting some ultramarine violet into those shadows, because once again that colour on the water is reflecting a little darker, a little deeper in the water itself. Just removing a little bit of that pigment off that buoy. Some ultramarine blue now. So I'm really quite changing the temperature of that. Just checking how damp that paper still is. The last thing I want to do is disturb any paint by resting upon it, and it was dry enough to do so, so that was good. I can't quite work out what that is I was painting. I think it may be just a secondary buoy that's floating at the base where the rope's down into the water. But I shall just give that a little bit of texture and let you decide, or the viewer decide, what it is they're seeing. But again, it's got a bit of reflection, and that translates down into the water too. Mixing up a bit more dark for the base of the bird and some more details. Reshaping the shape of the bird so it looks a little bit more duck-like. Now I'm going around some of the outer edges just to redraw what I feel the shape should be. That can be quite dangerous, because you get it wrong, then you will lose out and you'll stain the other value. So you've got to be a bit careful when doing what I'm doing. The thing was, I think that I've sort of almost in danger of making a mistake, so I'm washing out that by adding or reapplying colour over the whole area and re-wetting it. But rather that than end up with something that looks awful because it's created a cauliflower or something nasty in that space. Just taking a bit more care. Now quite simply, I'm putting some darks into the bird now. They are mixes of violet, they're reds and blues that give a much cooler but darker value against the browns of the bird. And the deepest darks that you're going to get around the head and also where the wings meet. So they're creating most shadow. And of course where the bird's sitting on the water itself, another area of deeper shadow. But already you can see that it does look like a duck is sitting on the water, but it doesn't need to have great detail. We're now warming up the bird again with a little bit more orange into that mix, so you get that lovely warmth suggested within the bird itself. By pulling the paint across the neck, you're suggesting that there is a nice amount of light, and given that there is shade on the back of the neck. So we really are now sort of closing in on the kill for this painting. We're trying to get it all finished off and refining little areas now, say the duck, maybe a bit more work on the buoy. And then we can wrap this one up. Just adding a few darker areas around the head so that where I may have lost it in that green, I can get it back by making a warmer value against the green, which is somewhat darker. So I'm sort of overlaying and redrawing that area. Again, a little bit more red, a little bit more warmth going into those shadows. And that works nicely with the greens because they're not quite complementaries, but they are sort of knocking on the door of being such. That lovely violet and the lovely green works quite well. Now let's make this Bowie really work for us. It needs to be warm. It needs to have, it's got that underlying cool colour that I left it at, but now I'm adding some vermilion into that ball shape so that it will stand up and be really strong. The reflection already has a much darker, cooler value underneath it, so that will come through the paint layer on top because they're transparent colours, so you get one radiate through the other. A really rich dark. Now we need to sort of suggest edges, strong shapes, strong contrast shapes between lights and darks, and they are the finishing touches. It's not just about your highlights, it's about your lowlights too. It's about those edges, those well-defined sharp edges that just punch the finish and push it over the finish line, I suppose. Now, some people frown on the use of white medium, whether it be an acrylic, gesso, or one of the other gouache. I use a white gouache, but it's just some areas with painting like this, some small little types of highlights, as hard as you try, can't always be maintained or retained. So I just use the odd touch. Don't overdo it, just a little bit here, a little bit there, where it really does make a difference. And now I think I'm pretty much done. And I've looked at it. So I think it's time now to sign the painting and wrap it up. And with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I certainly have enjoyed painting the picture for you. I'm sure you've got something from it, and if that's the case, then please like the video and add any comments, as I said earlier, and by all means please subscribe. And there will be other videos both there and there, so take a look and join me for the next video. All the best, happy painting, catch you all soon. Bye bye for now.